sending you all warm wishes for a peaceful and beautiful day. What if the greatest wealth a person can possess isn't found in successful contracts or luxury, but in the quiet, unspoken understanding of the one waiting at home? Today we witness Jack and Tu Tien finding a profound sanctuary in each other after a day of harsh judgments. If you believe that true partnership is the ultimate comfort, please subscribe to our channel. The early morning sun had only just begun to warm the garden when Tu Tien stepped outside with a small basket in her hand. The plants were still touched with dew, and the air carried that quiet freshness that only exists before the day fully begins. In the soft light, the little garden looked simple and honest, the kind of place shaped not by luxury but by daily care. Rows of vegetables stood in uneven but living order, and among them the tomatoes had ripened enough to be picked. Tu Tien moved carefully between the plants. She bent down with practiced patience, her fingers brushing aside leaves before selecting each tomato one by one. None of them were perfect. Some were smaller than she would have liked. A few had uneven shapes or skin marked by the weather. They were not the kind of tomatoes that would impress anyone looking for polished beauty. But to Tu Tien, they were still precious. They carried the quiet proof of her effort. Every one of them had grown from time, water, patience, and the willingness to keep caring for something even when the results came slowly. She placed them gently into the basket, handling them as if their small imperfections made them more real, not less valuable. That was how she saw most things in life. She did not need something to be grand in order to love it. By the time the basket was full enough, the sun had risen a little higher. Tu Tien wiped her hands lightly against her clothes, looked once more over the garden, and headed toward the market with the steady calm that had become part of her nature. At the market, she took her usual place in the familiar corner, where regular sellers and regular buyers had long since learned to expect her. It was not the best location, and her produce was never arranged in the flashy competitive style of larger stalls. But there was always something quietly inviting about the way she sat there, her vegetables and tomatoes laid out neatly, her expression open and gentle without ever trying too hard to win anyone over. People came and went. Some customers stopped because they knew her produce was fresh, some because her prices were fair. Others paused only long enough to ask for a lower price, bargaining over amounts so small they could almost feel insulting if she had allowed herself to take them personally. But Tu Tien never looked irritated. She listened. She answered softly. She agreed when she could, and when she could not, she declined without bitterness. The profits were small, sometimes painfully small, but she accepted that too as part of the rhythm of the day. This was not work that promised instant reward. It was the kind of work built on quiet endurance, and she had learned how to live inside that kind of rhythm without resentment. The market slowly warmed as the morning wore on. Dust rose underfoot. Voices overlapped, baskets shifted, coins changed hands. Tu Tien remained where she was, offering her homegrown harvest with the same gentle smile she always wore, as if no amount of haggling or small profit could take from her the deeper peace she carried inside. By the time she packed up to go home, there was not much left in her basket. What remained was modest, just like the earnings she carried with her. But even then, on the way back, she stopped at a small roadside shop and bought a tin of cat food. It was a tiny purchase, the sort of thing most people would not even notice, but for Tu Tien it felt natural. She had seen the thin stray cat near their home enough times to know it would likely appear again by evening. She never talked about such gestures as though they made her special. Kindness to her was simply part of how a person should move through the world when they were still able to care. Miles away, Jack's day could not have felt more different. While Tu Tien spent her morning in the sun and dust of the market, he walked into a high-stakes meeting carrying a thick folder of carefully prepared documents and a heart that still dared to hope. He had put real work into those proposals. Every page had been studied, organized and refined. The ideas inside were solid, the numbers made sense, the plan deserved to be taken seriously, he knew it. That was why he entered the room ready. But almost immediately, he felt something shift. The partners across from him did glance at the papers. They turned pages. They listened just enough to be polite. But their attention never stayed where it should have stayed. Instead of focusing on the work, their eyes kept returning to him, to his worn-out clothes, to the fatigue visible in his posture, to the dust still clinging faintly to him from the old motorcycle he had ridden there. It was subtle at first, then impossible to miss. Jack knew that kind of look. He had seen it before in different forms, in different rooms, from different people. It was the look of judgment arriving before understanding, the look that decides a person's value based on the wrong evidence. He kept speaking anyway. He presented every point clearly. He stayed composed. He did not let bitterness into his voice. But the room never warmed. The energy never shifted. Whatever chance the meeting had carried at the beginning slowly drained away beneath the cold surface of polite dismissal. By the end, the silence in the room felt suffocating. No one openly insulted him. No one needed to. The lack of real engagement said enough. When the meeting finally ended, Jack gathered his papers with calm hands, but inside the weight of it hit him hard. It was not only disappointment, it was the crushing emptiness of knowing he had brought something real to the table and had still been judged first by his appearance, his fatigue, and the signs of a life that had become harder than it once was. By the time late afternoon came and he reunited with Tu Tien, he was carrying that heaviness quietly. But the moment she looked at him, something in him loosened. He did not need to explain immediately. He did not need to say how the meeting had gone or describe the coldness of the room. Tu Tien looked into his tired eyes and seemed to understand enough without words. She gave him a small, soft nod, and that simple gesture grounded him more than any speech could have. Together, they got back on the motorcycle and rode toward a quiet plot of land near the river. The road there was calm, the late light gentler now, and when they arrived, they walked slowly side by side past a small house and an overgrown garden. The place was modest, quiet, and full of unrealized possibility. Jack looked over it thoughtfully. "It has potential," he said at last, "but we need to think more." Tu Tien followed his gaze and said nothing right away. She did not rush him. She simply stayed beside him, letting the silence be thoughtful instead of heavy. And in that quiet, after a day of being misjudged, Jack felt something return to him. Not certainty, not victory, but steadiness. On the way home, they stopped to pick up a few simple groceries. There was nothing luxurious in the basket they carried back. A little meat, a few vegetables, and some seasonings. Just enough for dinner. But after a day like that, the ordinary act of choosing food together felt strangely comforting. No one at the small shop cared about dusty clothes, tired faces, or what kind of motorcycle they had arrived on. There were no cold glances there, no polished smiles hiding judgment. Only familiar shelves, practical choices, and the quiet rhythm of an evening beginning. By the time they reached home, the light had softened even more. The house welcomed them in the way simple homes sometimes do best. It did not impress. It did not try to prove anything. But it held warmth, routine, and the kind of safety that cannot be purchased with status. Once inside, Tu Tien set down the groceries and moved naturally into the kitchen, while Jack followed with the ease of someone stepping into a space where he did not have to defend himself. Soon the modest kitchen was filled with the dry crackle of a charcoal fire. That sound alone changed the mood. The flame did not roar. It built itself slowly, with patience and a steady glow. Jack crouched near it, adjusting the coals until the heat was right. Then he began preparing the meat, handling the task with the kind of quiet focus that used to belong to larger battles, but now found peace in smaller ones. Tu Tien washed the vegetables, sorted the herbs, and set out what they needed without a word. They moved around each other easily, the way people do when they have shared enough life to understand rhythm without instruction. There was no need to discuss the meeting, no need to ask whether the rejection still stung. The answer already lived in the way Jack had looked when she first saw him that afternoon. And because she knew, she did not press. She simply stayed near. Jack turned the meat over the fire and let the heat do its work. The smell rose slowly, rich and familiar, filling the kitchen with something far kinder than the cold atmosphere he had walked out of only hours earlier. Beside him, a small bowl waited for the dipping sauce. He measured, mixed, and adjusted it carefully. And while he worked, he could feel the disappointment of the day losing some of its sharpness. That was the quiet magic of their life together. It did not erase pain in dramatic ways. It softened it. It reminded him that the world outside could be harsh without having the final word over his heart. Tu Tien glanced at him while slicing vegetables. "You added the chili already?" she asked softly. Jack looked up. "A little." She smiled faintly. "Then don't make it too strong." For the first time since the meeting, a small, real smile touched his face. "I know." That was all, but it was enough to shift something in him. Because this was the place where he was not reduced to his clothes, his dust, or the age of his motorcycle. Here, his worth was not up for evaluation. Here, he was simply Jack. And Tu Tien, without needing to say it aloud, always treated him as though that were more than enough. By the time dinner was ready, the kitchen held a comforting warmth. The food was simple but satisfying. Nothing about the meal was extravagant, yet it carried the kind of nourishment that goes beyond hunger. They sat down together and began to eat. For a while, neither of them spoke much. There was no uncomfortable silence between them. They simply ate, listening to the small sounds of the house and the distant movement of evening outside. The failed meeting remained unspoken. So did the judgmental eyes, the polite indifference, and the familiar sting of being measured by the wrong things. Neither of them needed to name it for it to be understood. And maybe that was why the peace of that moment felt so profound. Jack looked across the table at Tu Tien once or twice while they ate. She did not ask for explanations. She didn't force him to relive the humiliation. Her quiet presence said something gentler and far more powerful. You do not have to perform your pain here in order for it to be seen. That understanding settled into him with relief. Outside, the evening breeze had begun to move through the yard. It touched the leaves, passed along the edge of the house, and slipped quietly through the spaces where night was beginning to gather. Inside, the meal continued at an unhurried pace. At one point, Tu Tien reached for a little more sauce and said, almost casually, "The riverland still feels peaceful." Jack nodded. "It does. We can go back and look again." This time, he held her gaze for a moment before answering. "Yes, I think we should." There was no rush in the conversation. The land near the river, the small house, the overgrown garden, all of it could wait for careful thought. What mattered was that the dream had not been damaged by one difficult meeting. It was still there, still alive between them. The world had looked at him that day and decided too quickly what he was worth. But sitting there, with charcoal warmth still lingering in the kitchen and Tu Tien across from him, Jack could feel how little that judgment ultimately mattered inside the life they were building. Because what they had was not fragile. It did not depend on the approval of polished strangers in cold meeting rooms. It lived here, in shared routines, in groceries carried home together, in food prepared side by side, in silence that healed instead of wounded. When they finished eating, neither of them moved too quickly to clear the table. The evening had settled fully now, dark and gentle beyond the windows. The house felt wrapped in calm. Jack leaned back slightly and let out a slow breath. The disappointment had not vanished completely, but it no longer owned him. The coldness of that meeting had followed him home, yes, but here, in the sanctuary of their ordinary life, it had become something survivable. As the breeze brushed softly against their quiet home and the night settled around them, one gentle question seemed to linger in the darkness. Could this silent, unshakable partnership be the true shelter that protects them from the hard judgments of the world? Sitting there with Tu Tien, Jack felt that maybe the answer did not need to be spoken. Maybe it was already there in the fire, the food, the land they were still dreaming about. And the fact that after the world had looked at him harshly, he still had a place where he was seen clearly and loved completely.
Tử Tiên bắt đầu ngày mới bằng việc thu hoạch những quả cà chua không hoàn hảo nhưng được trồng cả tấm lòng rồi lặng lẽ, bán chúng ở chợ với sự kiên nhẫn và lòng tốt lành lạnh, thậm chí còn muốn ăn cho mèo quanh trên đường về nhà. Cho chú mèo và cô yêu quý cùng một đứa sắp bước vào cuộc họp quan trọng với những điều sắc mạnh mẽ và niềm hy vọng thật sự, nhưng lại bị đánh giá lạnh lùng vì những áo rách rưới và chiếc xe máy cũ kỹ thay vì những ý tưởng của anh. Sau đó không là những lời Tử Tiên hiện nay sự thất vọng của anh, cả hai cùng nhau đến thăm một khu đất yên tĩnh bên bờ sông và trở về nhà nấu một bữa ăn giản dị trong nhịp sống ấm áp. Ấy sắp tìm thấy được sự bình yên phẩm giá và một nơi điện tử ẩn náu ở nơi những phát xít khắc nghiệt của thế giới.